Thank you so much for joining us today, which is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, for a special event with Dean Anthony Davidson and Professor Adele Reinhartz, hosted by the Center for Jewish Studies and co-sponsored by Fordham School for Professional and Continuing Studies. I want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's here, whether you regularly attend our programs or this is your first time here. We're grateful to have you, and you're always welcome to come back. Before I introduce today's talk and today's speakers, I want to invite you to join us for some of our upcoming programs. In April, later this week, we have a lecture on Thursday night at 6 p.m. It's a book talk, a joint talk by David Myers and Nomi Stolzenberg about their new book, American Shtetl, The Case of Kiryas Yoel, New York. And that will be in conversation with Abner Green of Fordham Law School. On Tuesday next week here at Rose Hill, we're hosting Rivka Elitzur Lyman, who's a scholar of ancient amulets and daily life in late antiquity. And that will be held here on Tuesday morning in the theology department. And then later next week, we're having a lunch seminar with Amy Weiss in partnership with the Center for Jewish History on the topic of realigning faith, American Jews, Protestants, and Israel, 1945 to 2020. So please join us for these events and sign up for our newsletter to learn more about several events that we still have in May. I want to extend a lot of gratitude to Magda Tedder, my co-director at the Center for Jewish Studies, and Siobhan Verleza, our amazing administrator, who both work tirelessly on behalf of the center, to Fordham's special events team, and to our program sponsors, including Henry Miller, Eileen Sadler, Dario Wertheim, the Knapp Family Foundation, and Charlie Knapp, the Pickett Family Foundation, Eugene Schvidler, Bruce Terragan, and members of our advisory council, whose generosity allow us to do the work that we do. A few months ago, we co-hosted together with PBS NewsHour and the University of St. Thomas, a moving program at our Lincoln Center campus titled Remembering, talking about the Holocaust in the 21st century. The conversation, which included a Holocaust survivor, Eva Paddock, along with a number of journalists, scholars, writers, and artists, including Magda, focused both on the history of the Holocaust and also on how we remember the Holocaust today and into the future, as fewer Holocaust survivors are alive to share their firsthand memories, but when it has become even more crucially important for this horrendous history to be remembered. Today's event, in many ways, is a continuation of that conversation as we gather with two members of our community here at Fordham who are children of Holocaust survivors, and each of whom, in their own respective work, has found creative ways of sharing their mother's stories with others to preserve their memories and to make sure that we learn about the Holocaust and its aftermath. Anthony Davidson is Dean of Fordham's School of Professional and Continuing Studies, the university's College for Adult and Non-Traditional Students. He earned his BA and MBA from the Bernard B. Baruch College of the City of New York, and his doctorate in management and systems science from Cass Business School at the City University of London. He's an award-winning educator who has taught at Hofstra, Polytechnic University in Brooklyn, Adelphi University, and Yeshiva University. He was the founding dean of the Division of Programs in Business at NYU SCPS and served as dean of the School of Business at Manhattanville College before joining us here at Fordham. Today, he'll be sharing his mother's story with us in a talk titled From Munkacs to Manchester Through the Gates of Auschwitz. Following his talk, Anthony will be joined in conversation by Adele Reinhartz. Adele is a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa, and this semester is a faculty fellow at Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. A scholar of the New Testament and Jewish-Christian relations in antiquity, Adele has authored 9 books, including Befriending the Beloved Disciple, a Jewish reading of the Gospel of John, and Cast Out of the Covenant, Jesus, Jews, and Anti-Judaism in the Gospel of John. Adele is a member of the Royal Society of Canada and the American Academy for Jewish Research, and she served as president of the Society of Biblical Literature. Among her ongoing projects is a translation of her mother's diary, which she wrote during and following the Holocaust. Like Anthony's mother, Adele's mother was taken to Auschwitz during the war and survived the war. As Adele is unable to join us in person today, she'll be joining us in conversation by Zoom. And I'm grateful both to you, Anthony, and to Adele for sharing their family stories with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarit. Welcome and thank you to you all. Thank you especially to Magda Teta, the Chair in Judaic Studies, and Sarit Katan-Gribetz, who are the co-directors of the Center for Jewish Studies. It's my honor to be sharing the stage with Adele Reinhartz, Distinguished University Professor at the University of Ottawa. A special welcome to Provost Jacobs and the members of the Office of the Provost, the university leadership, my fellow deans, faculty, guests, most notably Jim Houlihan. Thank you very much, Jim, for coming, Board of Trustees member, and most importantly, our students. Many years ago, 75 years ago, really, there was a debate about how and when the Holocaust should be commemorated. We have a day of mourning traditionally in the Jewish calendar. It's called the 9th of Av, in which we commemorate all the calamities and the destruction of the temple that have befallen the Jewish people. And many people felt that that should be a day in which the Holocaust should also be remembered and mourned. The State of Israel decided to establish the Yom HaShoah, which is in the Jewish month of Nisan, which we currently find ourselves in. I believe that there's no conflict there. I think one day, the 9th of Av, commemorates the calamities that befell our people, whereas Yom HaShoah commemorates the positive. And I think it's no coincidence that it falls in a month that actually is a month of miracles, observes the multiple happy occasions and the redemption from Egypt. And to my mind, this day and this event, actually for me, is about emphasizing the positives. It's not just about people like Jacob Levertov, whom some of you may remember from Schindler's List, who had the gun pointed at his head, and after 3 times the Nazi guard just said, "Your God wants you to live," because the gun did not go off. He then survived to raise a family with whom I'm very close, as happens, and a daughter who was a winner on Jeopardy. Unfortunately, died young. She told me the story a long time before the movie. And when I went to the movie, I said to my wife, "This is exactly like Rebecca's story." And turns out it was after. They didn't know there were any survivors. They didn't realize there was any family at all. It's not about the esteemed rabbi, Grand Rabbi from Klausenberg, I think it's known as Cluj today, who was renowned for his kindness before, during, and after the war. When he was in a displaced persons camp, he took off his socks and gave them to a 3-year-old barefoot girl. And there's a story that somebody came up to him and said, "You know, I will never be religious again. I'll never believe in God again." And they said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "Because I was in the camps and I saw there were lines and lines of people waiting to use the prayer book that he had smuggled into the camps. But he wouldn't let them use it unless they gave him their daily ration of bread. I would never, ever believe in God if somebody can do that." And the rabbi turned around to him and said, "Yes, but did you ever think of the lines and lines of people who were willing to give up their bread just to use a prayer book for 5 minutes?" That's what it's about. Everybody who survived has an incredible story to tell. And it's really about how the survivors answer the question, where was God during the Holocaust? And many will tell you, where wasn't he? My mother was born in 1926 in a town called Munkacs. That's Hungarian way of pronouncing it. It's also known as Mukachevo, in Ukrainian, Mukasevo, Czech, Slovakian. It was the commercial capital of Transcarpathian, which is, again, many different names. Places in that region changed governments so often and country allegiance so often. They have many different names. Subcarpathian Rus region, which had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918. And then it became the most easternly part of Czechoslovakia till about 1938. Then it went back to the Hungarians before being annexed by the Soviet Union, and it's now part of the Ukraine. Its many names reflect the cultural crossroads of its location. She was the youngest of 4 siblings, 2 boys and 2 girls, and her father died when she was very young. She didn't really know him. Her mother, Rivka, raised them as a widow while eking out a meager living as a seamstress. Now, at least partly due to their geographic isolation, the Jews were among the poorest in Europe, and a large percentage of Jews there were employed in manual and agricultural labor. But Munkacs was a very rich existence in many other ways. It was materially impoverished, yet wealthy in ideological debate. The Munkacs Jewish community was famous for its Hasidic activity, as well as its innovations in modern Jewish education. There were sirens that went off in the town sometime to signal the start of the Sabbath. All the shops were closed on the Sabbath. The first movie house in the town was established by a Hasidic Jew, and it too was closed on the Sabbath and Jewish holidays. There was no Friday night at the movies in Munkacs, I'm afraid. The Jewish population in Munkacs grew from about 2,000 in 1825 to 10,000 in the 1920s, and the Jewish people made up about half of its residents. And the Jews in Munkacs were about 11% of the Jews in that region. It was very famous that people claimed that they used to live 2 fingers from Munkacs. And 2 fingers means, yes, on the map, 2 fingers away. The Grand Rabbi of Munkacs, known by one of his most famous books that he authored, the Minchat El-Azar, when his only daughter got married, it was a local holiday. I have pictures of this. There were soldiers on horses with white gloves. It was like a coronation. I know it was like Princess Di, but it's going back a while for those of you who remember. But other things, so you can actually see those things on YouTube. Now, there was a sequence of events following the Munich Agreement. Place called Zalshi, which is known as Shizen or Silesia or Schlesien. Again, many of the names reflected either Hungarian or German or Ukrainian. It's very interesting that my mother made a tape when she was in Washington at the opening of the museum. And on her tape, she mentions these towns, and I couldn't figure out where they were. And I always thought she made mistakes. But today with Google and everything else, I said, no, and actually she was right. That's what it's called. That's what she called it, obviously, because I can't find any of these places. So it was on a region on the border of Czechoslovakia and Poland that had been the subject of a long dispute between the 2 countries, and indeed had fought a war over in 1919. At noon on the 30th of September 1938, Poland gave an ultimatum to the Czechoslovak government. It demanded the immediate evacuation of the Czechoslovak troops and police, and gave the government in Prague until noon the following day to do so. At 11:45 a.m. on the next day, the Czechoslovak Foreign Ministry called the Polish ambassador in Prague and told him that Poland could have what it wanted. The Polish army, commanded by General Władysław Bornowski, annexed an area of about 801 square kilometers, with a population of about 227,000 people. In November 1938, Hungary occupied the border area, the southern area of Slovakia and the southern Carpathian Ruthenia. And in March 1939, during the German invasion of the remaining Czech territories, Hungary seized and annexed Sub-Carpathian Rus, taking advantage of the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Though anti-Semitic legislation was introduced by the Hungarian authorities, Sub-Carpathian Rus, like the rest of Hungary, remained a relatively safe haven for Jews until Germany occupied Hungary in 1944. My uncle, Mendu, who was a chazan, he was a cantor in Freistadt, Czechoslovakia, also known as Freistadt in alternative reading, in the Schlesien region. And all the Czechs were given 24 hours to pack their bags and move at least 100 kilometers inland, because the Poles were scared of an insurrection. So my mother happened to be visiting with him that weekend, and he asked my mother to go with him to Krakow because they had to move inland. She refused. And after traveling through Europe, narrowly escaping arrest, my uncle made his way to England, which accepted him as a priority scheme under a special accommodation for displaced Czechs because of the invasion and the Munich agreement and how that didn't really pan out. He lived in Notting Hill, London, have the address, and was recommended by the foremost authority in England at the time for a job at the Notting Hill Synagogue, which also no longer exists. Now, although my mother had a chance to go with him to Krakow, she would not leave her mother alone. And so at the tender age of 13, she went back to Munkacs. When they were rounding up the Jews 30 minutes away, everybody said, no, 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 it's impossible. It cannot happen here in Munkacs. There's no way. Look at the position we occupy. We're part of the government, et cetera, et cetera. And that perhaps is lesson number one, because sure enough, on April the 23rd, 1944, it did change. They were rounded up into a ghetto called the Telep, which was really a brick factory, taken to a brick factory, and then transported to Auschwitz. So my mother didn't really proactively speak about her experiences in the Holocaust, but she did not speak. So it was kind of reactive rather than proactive. There were some stories which she repeated with which we became familiar. Many I learned from my second cousins and others who survived, whom I met while I was studying and became close with in Israel. As I mentioned previously, she made a tape at a gathering in DC at the opening of the Holocaust Museum in 1983, which was an important documenting of the facts we had heard over time. And I strongly encourage anybody who knows any survivors who are still around to do the same, because even when I go back and listen, there's certain things I say, oh, slightly different. I just want to tell a couple of those stories today in the interest of time, and more importantly, reflect upon the impact they had upon me in my life. So they were on the transport to Auschwitz, and the people were very despondent. Her mother, Rivka, said to them very simply, and to everybody, for those of you who speak Yiddish, I'll translate, and for those who don't speak Yiddish, I won't. Hab bitachon, have faith. What's going to happen? So they'll put us to work, so we'll work. We're God's children, everything will be okay. And that was her mantra. They came to Birkenau. Some of you may know that there were two camps really there, Auschwitz, which was the internment camp, and Birkenau, which was the extermination camp. She was carrying her 2-year-old niece at the time. And as they approached the gates, so the inmates were saying to them in Yiddish again, "Gib weg the Kinder," which means give away the children. So I'll say this in the first person. My mother said, like, we thought they were crazy. What do you mean? Why would I give away my children? And of course, nobody did, because my mother said we thought they were crazy. As she came up to Mengele, she saw there were trucks where there were mothers and children riding, whereas everybody else had to walk. And she made the following calculation, which I find to be quite astonishing. And you'll see why in a moment. She said, it's really not appropriate that my older sister should walk and I, as the younger sister, should ride. That's just not, and I'm a youngest child, so you understand why I find that difficult, okay? She said, it's just not right. So she gave her niece back to her sister. Little did she know that, of course, anybody who had children, they were on the carts and they were riding because they were taken straight to the gas chambers. And she knew other people who died because they were helping and carrying other people's children. She was taken to Block C, which was known as Vernichtungslager. And if that sounds like an unpleasant word, it is because it is an unpleasant word. It really means the annihilation section. And as she arrived there, her welcome message was from the inmates was, see, you come in through the gate and you go out through the chimney. And again, she said, we thought they were crazy. People don't realize you can't grasp something like that. They conducted, of course, daily selections, and I'm sure many of you know. But she said, and she, of course, was separated from her mother and her sister at the time, and her brother, that the message of hope and faith in God remained in her mind all the time. And she said to herself, as her mother said, we will survive. And she said, I don't know how, because if the Nazis win, they'll kill us. And if they lose, they'll certainly kill us. I don't see a possible way. But that's what they said. And she said she always volunteered for work. That seemed to be the only way to survive. So twice a day, they gathered for a tselapel, which means an accounting. If someone was missing or wasn't accounted for, they stood or they knelt for hours. Doesn't matter what the weather was. And it could have been that person was just visiting someone else in a different block. At a selection, they made people, 6 people, form a ring, holding hands very tightly, so that those selected, the people inside, could not escape. If one of them escaped, then one of the people holding hands was taken in their place as a substitute. Every day the SS came, they counted the number of people in the ring, made sure they were all there and accounted for, and then they took them to the gas chambers. One time, my mother was one of the 6 people holding hands, and a young girl, a stranger, was selected and was taken into the middle of the ring. And she was screaming as she was separated from her mother and her sisters, and her mother and her sisters were screaming. My mother said she couldn't bear it anymore. She fought to wrest her hand out from the lady who was holding her hand, a large lady at the time, tight grasp. She eventually broke the grip. She says that was probably the biggest miracle, okay? And she pulled this girl from the middle of the ring and she threw her back to her family. The woman from whom she had broken her grasp turned to her and said, "You're absolutely insane, because when they count, as they always do, I am going to tell them that it was you who did this, because I'm not going to risk going in your place, and I'm not going to die for anyone." The SS came and they took the group and they left, and they forgot to count that day. Many years later, my mother got a letter saying that this girl, her name was Chori Spielman, had survived, and that every Friday night she lights the candles for the Sabbath, she mentions my mother's name. She has children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. In 1981, I was with my parents in Miami during the Passover holiday, walking down Collins Avenue, and I met the family. And I heard the children say to my mother, my grandchildren say to my mother, "Thank you for saving Grandma's life." As my mother tells the story on the tape some 40 years later, she says, "This was not me, it was God." She says, "I was just a messenger. Nobody in their right mind would have done something like this. It was beyond comprehension." Let's fast forward to 2003, and I received a call that this lady passed away. Happened to be, she lived not far from me at all. I didn't know that at the time. And there was a Shiva house in Kew Gardens. And I went to pay a visit, and all these people in the room and young little kids, 2-year-olds running around, and her sister was there. And I went in and said, "Hi, I'm Anthony Davidson." She says, "I'm sorry, I don't know who you are." I said, "I know you don't know who I am, but I'll mention a name that you will know." And I mentioned my mother's name, and she kind of goes white. And she told me the story from her perspective. And she said, we had no way, we're screaming, we didn't know your mother, we had no right to say anything, this was crazy. And then she said something which still gives me goosebumps to this day. She just pointed over to the other room and she said, "You understand that not one person in that room would be alive if it wouldn't be for your mother." So she knew she had to get out of Birkenau. She volunteered, but she never knew if it was good or bad. The Germans, if it wasn't difficult enough, they used to play tricks. So we have a transport coming out of Auschwitz, but they used to trick people because sometimes it would really be going to be for the extermination and not going to another factory. And you never knew if it was good or bad. The way you could eventually tell is if they saw that some of the capos who were friends with the SS were on the transport, they figured it was going to be okay. However, then the Nazis figured out, oh, that's what they're doing. So as if life wasn't difficult enough, they had capos get on the transport and then get off on the other side. So you never, ever knew what was good, what wasn't. And that happened, my mother said, several times. Got on and got off, got on and got off. Finally, somebody came and were looking for 50 of the best and strongest people. My mother she was only 18 at the time. She was emaciated. She tried to get on this particular transport to factory and she was yanked off. And she was told, "You have no chance of being able to get on. It's impossible. You won't be able to do the kind of work they're looking for." she didn't give up. She was somebody who had dressed up as a young Hasidic boy and danced on the Purim table in front of the Grand Rabbi of Munkacs. So she wasn't about to quit that easily. She took stones, she stuffed them into her cheeks, and she went around the other side. And she got on, and she was about to be yanked off once more. And the factory director said, and as my mother said, the words still ring in her ears, sie ist gut. She's okay. She'll be all right. And she was on the transport, and she got out of Auschwitz, from where she went to Gleiwitz, in German Gleiwitz. That actually was a sub-camp of Auschwitz, founded in March 1944 at Repair Yard. She arrived at Gleiwitz, and she saw the chimneys, and she said, bad move. We volunteered, and now it's the end. She was very afraid at that time, but the reason why there were chimneys was because they were working for 12 hours a day in a very hot factory making tar for roads. And as I said, she always volunteered. And she knew from her Auschwitz days, if you were idle, it was the end. One job she had was dividing bread for people. Everybody got 5 pieces. She said a job that nobody wanted, because if one piece was bigger than another, then there were people who would kill you for that. And my mother said sometimes she just felt like even cutting off a piece of her finger just to make sure everything was even. Got a job chopping wood. She said the chopper was bigger than she was. And in general, the climate was not good, because even the people who were the non-Jewish inmates used to turn around and say, good, there's another dead Jew. They were fed some leafy soup, which actually the Germans put bromide in to kind of sedate the people, and some bread. How? She doesn't know, but she said on Passover, she didn't eat the bread. She said, I'm not sure how I managed that. Of course, she would have been absolutely allowed to do so without any questions. But she said, we couldn't throw it away because they would perceive that as a mutiny, as like a hunger strike. So she's not quite sure how she did that. Anyway, as the Allies were approaching, she was taken to Ravensbrück. You can Google it. It's a women's only concentration camp. Not a nice place. As I said, you can Google it. From the camp's initiation till the day of liberation, 117,000 of 132,000 women there were eliminated and murdered. No food, no nothing. It used to snow. It was mostly thirsty than hungry. And they used to make contracts with each other that I'll eat the snow on your coat and you eat the snow on mine, because obviously you can't reach your own. There was a time where the Czechs threw bread, but if people climbed out of the The truth of the matter is that nobody can understand the mindset of people at the time. Just when she thought it was the end, a loaf of bread literally landed in her lap, as we would say, manna from heaven. She was then taken to a place called Rechlin, otherwise known as Retsov, which is a sub-camp of Ravensbrück. And with the Soviet Red Army's rapid approach in 1945, the SS leadership decided to remove as many prisoners as they could to avoid leaving any evidence and any live witnesses. They ordered all physically capable women to form a column and exit to Mecklenburg, forcing 24,500 prisoners on a death march. From there, they were taken to Malchow, and this is during 1944 where most of the death marches were taking place. And then they were taken to Masma, they were brought to Wismar, placed on barges that were sunk in the Baltic Sea. Before that happened, my mother decided she had to escape. And she had what's known as a Lagerschwester, which I can best translate as a buddy. If you remember, in the pool, you have a buddy system. So I had a buddy system with this person called Jolly Seidenfeld. They were going to look after each other. And they decided on April 28th, 1945, to escape together. They hid in a ditch. And then whenever they jumped from the train, hid in a ditch. When everybody passed, they hid in the forest. And they met 5 other escapees. And they stayed in the forest for 3 days. The watchman came out, said the coast is clear. She said it was just incredible. All you did, well, you were walking over corpses, basically. So that's what freedom meant. You were walking over corpses. And then they got news on May the 2nd, 1945, that the Russians had liberated. She went to a deserted house, and her Lagerschwester, her buddy, Yoli, came down with what's known as Fleck typhus. It's a rather virulent strain of typhoid. The other 5 escapees who were with her immediately ran away, and my mother had a decision to make, because running away would mean that person is definitely going to die. On the other hand, she was free, and she should have left, but she decided not to. Again, she said it's not her, it's a higher authority. She stole a bike, went to a hospital, got some medicines. She asked the nurses there, could she get it? And they said, well, it's the most contagious disease around, and you're malnourished and being in a, yeah. She still went back. She bathed her, and she slept in the same bed with her. The Russians, this is what liberation was. The Russians made her work. She brought a doctor's note explaining that Yoli had typhus and couldn't work. And they told her, yes, she can't work, but you can. That was liberation, by the way. And for the most part, they just hid in a cellar, and they dressed up and pretended to be old women for obvious reasons. When Yoli got really sick, my mother made the doctor come and give her an injection, and eventually she got malaria as well, and this was taken to the hospital. In the hospital, and people may ask why I believe in God, in the hospital were all 5 people who had run away. They all had typhus. One of them died. My mother never got it. This woman survived. She reunited with her husband and was living in Israel. My mother met her in Switzerland one time. My uncle, Moshe, was a musician, a composer, a soccer player, and in general, what we would call a temperament, which means a character. When he was in Munkacs, he used to take in displaced refugees, and he fed them. They were very poor, I might add. His mother was a seamstress, widowed at a young age. And then his wife got a bit upset. So he used to send them to a restaurant and pay for them to eat in a restaurant. His wife complained. She said, like, you're the richest man in Munkacs. We have no money. This is what you can afford to do. And he responded, and I want to quote, because I think it's a very powerful message. And he turned to his wife affectionately and he said, silly girl, the possessions that I have, none of them are mine. I will take nothing with me. The only thing I will take with me are the things I give away. That statement stayed with my mother forever. My uncle Moshe one time saw there was an amputee who used to sleep in the synagogue. And he said, you know, he's probably never been in a bed in his life. And he brought him home and put him in his bed. He was a violin player and an accomplished one at that. And that kept him alive because the SS used to ask him to play for them. He got sick and he was in a hospital, and they set fire to the hospital as they were fleeing Auschwitz, and he was burned alive in the hospital. And that's why we actually have his exact date of death, which is the last day of Passover. And both, as I said, my mother's mother and other sister perished on that first day. There are a number of other miraculous turns of event that enabled my mother to eventually make it to England. She had my uncle, who had gotten out earlier, the cantor's address, and she said she used to memorize that and repeat it every single night before the, what I think we would call Vespers, okay, before the prayers, for going to sleep. And again, I've told you a couple of stories. You can see the coincidences, there were equal ones. I want to just close with the impact and lessons that I feel it had on me. As she said, as my mother said, no physical strength, no food, no clothing could have helped me survive. Only the words of my mother in the transport, have faith. On a tape, and this is my message to the students here, on the tape, she always talks about the next generation and the next generation. When she saved those people, she said, I wasn't saving them. What I saw was all the generations that would come from them. And she said, yes, the Allied bombing, had they gone ahead, would save 10,000 for that day, but it's not the 10,000. It's not only 10,000, it's all the generations that would come from them. Not looking at the individual, but looking, both cases a stranger, by the way, but to the global picture. And there's always karma. When my oldest brother was 18 months old, and those days there were no car seats, you didn't sit in the back, you sat on your mother's seat in the car, and they weren't always so safe. So he actually flew out, the car door opened, and he flew out on what was known as the East Lancs Road. It's a dual divided highway. Think of a 2 lanes dual carriageway, of course, at about 50 miles an hour. And my mother said, I've saved people, now it's your turn. And they stopped the car, and she got out, and there he was on the floor. No cars came, picked him up, and went on. And by the way, that's why we always sat in the back seat until I was about 38. So, and it was only, she would only get what we call a coupe. You'd only a 2-door car. She would not get a 4-door car. That stay with her. In her very last years, she, as she had dementia, was progressing, and she was in hospital one time with a urinary tract infection. And there was a Filipina lady who used to take care of her, Amalia, who was an angel. I mean, I don't think any child could take care of a parent the way she did. So I walk in one day, and she says, you have to leave now. And I'm like, okay. And I said, why? She says, because I'm now going to change the sheets, and I'm going to take a towel and dry, she's called a babi, which is Yiddish for grandma, dry her down. And I said, like, Amalia, we're in a hospital, okay? They do things like that. They have people who do things like that. She says, you don't understand. She says, underneath the sheet is a plastic bed cover, and that makes her get very sweaty and uncomfortable. And I don't want that for her. And my first thought was, remember the story I told you? How my mother washed and bathed that lady in the bed? Nothing goes by. I was at a 60th reunion for Munkacs survivors, and some people asked me if my mother was there. I did bring her, but and they said, can we see her? And I said, yes, but she's not really very responsive. And they said to me, we just want to be in her presence. I do regret not having an extended family, but every holiday was a most positive experience. My mother's never said anything negative. I remember distinctly sitting on the bed with her, learning prayers, learning songs, learning the Manishtana, watching her prepare each dish from scratch, unique to every holiday. That was a rich and rewarding experience that she gave me that built a passion for my religious life. And that's what my mother was about, taking a no situation and making it into a yes. No, you can't go on that transport. Yes, I will. Her decision when she went back to Munkacs for a day where nobody was really observing anything, and it was a seminal moment. Am I going to give it up? Am I going to continue to be religious? And her mother's face came to her, and she said that's it. And she remained religious. When there was no financial aid for children with disabilities in Israel, she started a branch of the Friends of Berlin Orthopedic Hospital in England. When there was no hope for Russian refuseniks, she ended up a girl from a small town in the Ukraine, addressing the World Conference on Soviet Jewry in Brussels in English, which was at the time the 6th language. When there was nothing that could be done for people selected to be gassed, she could only see the generations that would come from them, and she saved them. She never spoke about revenge, other than to say she had the opportunity after she met the capos who had been in the camps with her, but she had no desire to so do. She has children, and grandchildren named after every one of her family who perished. That was her revenge. She has grandchildren who have been what they call the March of the Living, where they take students to Auschwitz. My daughter has done that. She's studied Torah with them. She sang songs with them. And she's told these stories in the barracks at Auschwitz. That was her revenge. In fact, my daughter Leah, who led tours for university students in the UK, took them to the very block C that I mentioned earlier. Took them to that block. Of course, those of you who know me know that me, and by extension my family, are totally irreverent. So when a couple of people were messing around in the barracks, she just turned around to them and said, "Oh, get off my grandmother's bed." Now, bed, of course, being a wooden plank so narrow that 1,000 people slept in an area built for less than half that amount. But that is revenge. I wonder if things might have been very different had the world reacted as it now is reacting to things that are happening in those very neck of the woods. But every person has to feel this experience to understand. 2 weeks ago was the 11th anniversary of my mother's passing, and I'm mindful of what she said in an interview. We cannot forget. We couldn't even if we wanted to, but our children. So I'm passing on this message to you, our students here at Fordham, in a place where caring about others and caring about things in the world is so important. It's the DNA of this university. You are students who can make a difference. You are students who clearly care enough to attend a university such as Fordham, where caring is a requirement, it's not an option. When you have a decision to make, and perhaps it presents an internal conflict for you, always, and I mean always, think about the next generation. Thank you very much.
Adele, please start whenever you want.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure that the sound is working. I believe that it is. Thank you very much, Anthony, if I may use your first name in this context, for that very moving account of your mother's experience. You provided such a wonderful sense also of your mother as a person, her personality, her strength of personality, her humor, and especially her strong faith. You mentioned early on that every survivor has their own story. Of course, that's absolutely true. And also, I would want to broaden that to say that every survivor also has their own way of understanding why they survived or how to kind of process the sequence of events that led to their survival. Because for everybody, it involved miracles. There is no buddy who survived whose survival was not conditional on miracles or coincidences or sheer luck, however one wants to describe that. So I want to reflect a little bit on some of the themes that came out in your talk from the perspective of my mother's experience. Now, my mother was born in 1926 in Łódź in Poland, which at the time had a very large Jewish population. I think approximately 1/3 of the population was Jewish. The Jewish residents of Łódź, as it's called in Yiddish, were herded into the ghetto in early 1940, and the ghetto was closed off in May of 1940. And it was one of, or perhaps the longest lasting ghettos, with the final liquidation taking place in August of 1944. So my mother, her sister, and their parents were in the Lodz ghetto from 1940 to 1944. From there, they were sent to Auschwitz, which was the last time that my mother and her sister and their mother saw the father. And they also, I think, survived with a similar philosophy, which is just volunteering for all of the labor duties. And so they only spent a few days in Auschwitz and were then sent to a labor camp, the women and the family. And they were liberated from Bergen-Belsen on April 15th, which my mother always referred to as her second birthday, the day that she was reborn. But the main difference, so there's a difference in experience having to do with the communities in which our mothers grew up, and the history of those communities during the Nazi era. But the main difference is that whereas your mother was a very devout person, my mother was a completely secular person. She and her family were very deeply involved in the Jewish Labor Bund, which was a Jewish anti-religious, anti-Zionist, highly secularized organization, very much devoted to the Yiddish language, literature, and the preservation of such, and that included after the war as well. So the sorts of events that your mother attributed or understood as coming from God, my mother always explained as having to do with both luck, but also the strength of the organization. And she always said to us that anybody who did not belong to an organization, be it Zionist or Bundist or religious, didn't have really a chance of survival, because those organizations were able to provide certain things for their members and for others as well that individuals couldn't do. I think this pertained primarily to the time in the ghetto. And so in our family, one of the main themes was really cultural and spiritual resistance that came about through people helping each other in the context of these organizations, providing medicine, providing clandestine education, providing information through illegal radios. So I don't know, you know, what you think, you know, in terms of this whole question of the interpretation of experience, and does that, how does that even shape the next generation in terms of how they understand themselves in continuity with the parents who survived the Holocaust?
Thank you, Adele. So I think that obviously it's true that every single person who went through the camps and through the experience has their own incredible story to tell. That's indisputable. And how they dealt with that experience is also very different, both how they dealt with it internally and how they dealt with it with their families. And many people refused to speak about anything at all. It was like a different lifetime and nothing happened. In terms of your question as to how people perhaps identify best or how they carry that message, I think it's up to each individual to internalize and to best reflect the values with which they grew up and the messages. I believe there's messages in everything. I think there's messages that can be found in every experience in life, and obviously large and impactful experiences such as these, even to a greater degree. Anybody, again, talking from my vantage point, anybody who survived the Holocaust just like anybody who survives any traumatic event such as that, whether it's 9/11 or whether it's the Boston Marathon bombing or anything else around the world, survives for a reason. And the reason is to make a difference in this world, in my opinion. And that is a universal message that people can pass on to their progeny.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. And also on what you said towards the end about revenge. How does one have revenge? And my mother always said as well that her children and her grandchildren were her revenge on Hitler. She really put it exactly that way. Surviving, fulfilling her career ambitions, her travel ambitions, and having a family of her own. These she saw as her revenge. So for her also, it had to do with future generations. My mother also, she was a teacher. She did teacher training after the war. She remained in Europe as a refugee after the war, coming to Canada only in 1951. But 3 of those years she spent in Paris at the Yiddish Teachers Seminary in Paris. And then when she came to Canada, she was a Yiddish teacher, initially in the Workman's Circle Afternoon School, 5 days a week, and then in a Jewish day school. And so her mission was really had to do with Yiddish. It had to do with the continuity of the language and the secular literature that was written in that language. And in addition, she went around to schools in Toronto and other places in Canada, speaking about her experiences as a survivor. So I think in both cases, there is that sense of legacy, the legacy that you leave. And of course, there are different ways in which that legacy can be expressed.
So much for sharing your mother's story with us, and Adele for sharing some of your mother's story with us. And I want to open the floor, if you're open to it, to questions or reflections for a few minutes before we wrap up.
Can I just read a quote? I am teaching exactly a class on the Holocaust tomorrow, and we're reading some primary sources, and one of the sources we're reading talks about the Warsaw Ghetto, and the text that says the watchword of the organized groups of the Jewish community was to live with honor and die with honor. That we made every effort to carry out this watchword in the ghettos and concentration camps. An expression, therefore, was the wide scope of the cultural work that was undertaken, notwithstanding the horrible terror, hunger, poverty, which grew and spread until the martyr death of the Polish Jewry. And what I found in both of your stories is that resilience and that dignity that both of your mothers carried through these horrors. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Magda. Anybody have any questions, or as Sarit said, reflections?
I just wanted to add that tomorrow is actually the 80th anniversary of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which in the Yiddish Bundes community was the main commemoration of the Holocaust was actually on April 19th every year. And tomorrow it's the 80th anniversary, and there are various celebrations and commemorations happening in the New York area tomorrow.
I'd love to hear some questions from some students. To be brave and bold and resilient. Yes.
My name is Xavier. I'm a senior, and as a part of my undergraduate capstone, I am writing a synthesis paper between transphobia in America and a synthesis of Nazi Germany. Can you speak about what you have seen in America and how that kind of correlates to either your own story or any other like discussions of the Nazis' work with Jewish people?
Thank you for that question. So it's difficult for me to speak about it because I would say that in my experience here in America, in terms of certainly anti-Semitism, as I mentioned in our little pre-discussion, I've experienced two incidents. And in England, it was much more serious. I mean, I never went to play a football match for my school team or a cricket match, and it didn't involve some kind of rumble afterwards where we were picked on. Or I could be riding my bike and a group of lads would just come out and, pick a fight because I was Jewish. My two events over here happened, one here in Keating, actually, and the ground floor cafeteria. And people look surprised. Yeah, well, I'll explain to you. It's not as bad as you think. I just decided that I'm going to kind of watch my intake of calories, and they got this new line of kosher Rockland Bakery muffins, which are about 700 calories each at the time. And I consider that to be absolutely. The other one is more serious. I was getting out of the subway on 42nd Street, going to my office in opposite the New York Public Library. And it was UN week, and I was just crossing over the road, and some complete stranger, cool dude, fairly tall, mirrored specs, sunglasses, says to me, Ahmadinejad's in town, let's hope he finishes off the job that Hitler started. So I, as my colleagues know, I'm a bit of an idiot. So I actually ran after him. You don't need to make it more than that. Ran after him and said, "Do you say something?" Because at least have the decency to stop and say it back to him. And he was very taken aback. And he kept on walking, and I kind of grabbed him and I said, "If you've got something to say, say it. But let me tell you something. You guys have been trying to finish us off for a few thousand years. I don't think he's going to succeed this week." Okay, so it's very difficult for me to really comment meaningfully on forms of discrimination, because I feel very fortunate in the fact that that is the thing that probably has been most as one isolated incident, and where there might be other things where one can say, well, maybe it would have been different had I not been wearing a yarmulke or something. That's a choice I make. And I do want to acknowledge somebody in the audience who was a very meaningful person to me and who came here, especially Helen. Helen, would you stand up for me, please? Helen Sapp over here is somebody who started with me at NYU, just the two of us. And when I left, we were the largest division in the school at the time. Helen really was my mom. I mean, my mother was living obviously in England at the time, but with her ideals and her sense of having faith and being there for me when times were difficult. And she and I have had a lot. You can sit now, Helen. Thank you so much. We shared many things together, and we talked about many different forms of discrimination. So, for instance, I remember, Helen, I don't know if you remember this. I said, so is it really different? Let's say if you're driving, on the New Jersey Turnpike and you get pulled over by a cop, is it? I can't relate to that, because in the car, people don't see my yarmulke, right? That's different from the color of the skin. And it's just very enlightening. Or even talking to other people over here, talking to Nicole about things that happen, which is very, very difficult, despite all the things I know of and my experiences. So in any discrimination, it's very, very difficult to understand what those people are going through. It's very difficult for me to comprehend how somebody can be interrogated by police outside their own home because they don't believe that they own that home. It's very difficult. And just like I don't expect people to understand anti-Semitism, because as Adele said, just like we all have different experiences going through, our experiences of anti-Semitism are also very different. and difficult to understand. I don't know if there's anybody, Jewish person here in New York, can really understand what it means that if we as a group of lads wanted to go out in the evening walking, we never went unless we were like 5 or 6 people, or to be sitting in a movie theater and have your yarmulke knocked off by the people who are sitting behind you. So as Adele said, and as Maggie said, in terms of resilience, in terms of how you deal with it, how you react to it, the answer is there's always going to be people like that. And you have to rise above it. And you have to be dignified. And you have to live. And arguably, they'll die with honor. And that's what the things that people in the camp, people say lambs to the slaughter. People died with honor in those situations. People died with defiance. People died singing. People died with prayers on their lips. Yes, Lou.
Anthony, very inspirational story, your mother and you too, Adele.
Thank you.
I couldn't help think is that when we listen to a polarized media, people use the term Nazi or refer to the Holocaust. And I just don't, maybe with the exception of American slavery in American history, I don't think anything else compares to what this was. I think by sometimes people throwing out those terminologies and making an example, they really dishonor the memories of the people that you guys are talking about. And thank you very much.
Thank you. It's an interesting point. I think as experiences fade into memory and into history, it's very easy to make analogies. And I think it's knee-jerk reactions. I personally, but I'm a little off the path there, of course. I don't take that as dishonor. I just take it as not fully understanding the magnitude of what's happening over here. And I would say to you that if you go to Auschwitz and you see the piles of thousands of children's shoes, if you go into one of the gas chambers and you see the fingernails on the walls, if you go into one of the gas chambers and you see written a couple of words, scratched, etched in the walls with fingernails, a couple of verses from the Bible, then you'll understand dignity and then you'll understand honor. And I think in the other extreme as well, I personally was upset. There was a friend of mine's child was attending a university out of state, and one of the board of trustees members resigned. He wasn't forced to, but he did because of some outcry, whatever it was, again, from other people, not necessarily Jewish people, because he had been in a play when he was 20 years old in college, and he portrayed a Gestapo officer, and he was wearing an SS symbol on. I mean, how else are you supposed to portray? It's in a play. I mean, and I actually offended the other way. It's about, Magda, it's about pride. It is. It's about pride, and it's about honor, Adele. That's what it is. And it's about resilience, and it's about rising above it. Yeah.
Also, I think the resilience and not to be defined by the people who want to demonize the other people. And the other thing I think is important to remember that the scratches on in the barracks and the chimneys are the end game. That's where it ends. And people are grasping for analogies because they look at the earlier period. So they are not necessarily looking at the end. And as the Auschwitz Memorial Museum said, it didn't start with the gas chambers. It started with words, started with images, it continued into law, and then it implemented into action.
I want to just mention one story of revenge. We're sitting, you're the Schwidler chair, of course, and Eugene Schwidler was the, until recently, the co-owner of Chelsea Football Club, as some of you may have heard me mention in the past. And I do remember in 2012, when Chelsea reached the Champions League final, and my mother had just passed that year, a month beforehand. And my daughter said to me, like, what's going to happen in the game? And because we were massive underdogs, was complete, like, giant killers really to even reach there. And she said to me, so, what's going to happen? I said, we'll win. She just goes like, why? And he says, don't worry, Bubby, grandma will help us. And she said to me, well, how is grandma going to help us exactly? And I said, she'll never let the Germans win. We were playing against Bayern Munich, and their phrase at the time was, what to go? I'll translate it from German. It was, our team, it was in their stadium, coincidentally, it's randomly selected. It happened to be our team, our stadium, our cup. Well, it wasn't theirs, it was ours. I can't think of a better note upon which to finish.
So thank you for ending on a positive note. I want to thank everyone for coming, for being able to hear the stories, laugh at the jokes, ask hard questions. I think that's really what we do every time we're in a classroom, we have a conversation, we read a text, we meet someone for the first time, is really to think about the world, the past, the present, the communities that we want to create, and really working towards justice in everything that we do. So today is a good day to remember. And I want to thank you. And I want to thank you, Adele, and everyone really here at the university who makes the work that we do possible to really think about this in conversation with one another. So thank you.